In the past century, more than 200 wars have ravaged our planet.
The military's impact on climate change, on the environment, is significant and cannot be ignored.
Radioactive waste was everywhere, and wherever they dropped it, that's where it stayed.
When push comes to shove, the national security mission trumps concern for the environment.
The cost of doing nothing outweighs the cost of doing something.
What are the ecological consequences of the military's special status? What is the impact of warfare on the environment? In the winter of 1916, more than 1 million French and German soldiers clash near the French town of Verdun. On February the 21st at 8:12 a.m., the sound of steel thunder fills the countryside. Once the day's battle is over, 9 hours and 12 minutes later, the norms of modern battle have changed forever. The century of war can now begin.
In a single day, the Germans fired 200,000 to 300,000 shells from 1,300 artillery positions. These were immense volumes. The world had never seen anything like it before.
In the hills around Verdun, each side seeks to bleed out the enemy, an objective that the German and the French armies pursue with all the means available to them. Nature has nothing to defend itself against the machinery of war, and the machinery is just getting started. Verdun will later become an emblem of industrialized warfare. The order from the French command is as simple as it is fatal. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass. The French are instructed not to surrender a single meter to the enemy. By the end of the battle, nothing remains of this historically rich region in northern France. The main area of battle, the Zone Rouge, is still a death trap today. For decades, only scrub oaks grew here. The land is riddled with leftover munitions and unexploded bombs. For 10 months, the battle wages, concentrated in an area no larger than 40 square kilometers. Life itself becomes just another resource of war. There is so much fighting, soldiers must work in shifts. The barrage of artillery is constant. The battlefield is a gruesome place of work. Never before had so many soldiers been killed in so small an area. Shell shock was rampant among the survivors. It is a historical turning point, one with fatal consequences for man as well as for nature.
There was nothing left here. No soil, no humus, absolutely nothing. Just imagine, there was nothing but stones. The humus was no longer on the surface, because, having been under constant fire, it had been repeatedly respread. How then could anyone possibly have got through with a plough here, or with anything else for that matter? This was really no longer possible, and it would never again be leveled, neither the totally destroyed forests nor the fields. No single square meter remained untouched. There was nothing but shell craters.
To protect themselves, soldiers dig trenches through the countryside. They have less and less contact with their enemies. Man-to-man combat is no longer in keeping with the times. What counts now are the range and destructive force of the artillery shells.
The defining mark of World War I is that you don't see the enemy. Death comes from 5 to 10 kilometers away. You can't leave the trench either, because the opponent's weapons will kill you as soon as you raise as much as your helmet.
The hill named the Dead Man, Le Mort Homme, earns a sad notoriety. The enemy positions there are shelled so relentlessly that the hill loses 10 meters in height by the end of the battle. Verdun serves as a test lab for modern weapons of mass destruction. It marks the first time that poison gas is used in artillery shells. It allows toxic chemical agents to be delivered more accurately to enemy lines, killing everyone in their path. Inconceivable numbers of munitions are sent to the front line. The supply seems endless. This changes the nature of warfare. Earlier battles lasted only a few days before men and ammunition were consumed. This time, there's no end to the fresh supply. It permits military leaders to rely on a new strategy: constant fire. All in all, both sides launch a combined total of more than 60 million shells.
The battle can be described as the most intensive form of resource consumption imaginable. What was new about World War I, and what happened again in World War II, was a reorganization of each side's industrial production. Now, they were able to compensate for the massive consumption of resources.
The shift to a war economy allows production numbers that were unthinkable in the 19th century. By the end of the war, just as many munitions are produced each month as were available in total when the war broke out. Whoever wants to wage war now must rely on industrial power at home.
This provided a lesson. Because technological advances continue, and because we can't predict the next war, we now produce arms for their own sake, not only to ensure military supplies in the long run, but also to stay permanently innovative.
Within decades, the world has armed itself to the brink of complete annihilation. In the Second World War, bomber fleets can set whole cities ablaze within minutes. Planes carpet bomb large swathes of land, dropping enormous amounts of ordnance in the process. After the war ends, millions of tons of munitions become unusable from one day to the next. It is the largest overproduction in history. On Canada's eastern seaboard, off the coast of Nova Scotia, lies one of the main ocean routes between Europe and North America. This gives the region great importance for the military, especially during the World Wars. Here, warships were once loaded with arms from giant munitions arsenals.
Right now we're at Rent Point in the Bedford Basin in Halifax. In July 26, 1945, Canada had the third largest navy in the world. They were coming back from the Second World War and they were offloading all the munitions here at the basin. So what we have here today is the basin is just full of munitions. All the land sites are full of munitions as well.
Ammunition storage after World War II found little support among the population. Here at Bedford Bay in Halifax, there had already been an enormous explosion during the First World War. After another major incident occurred in 1945, something had to happen.
The idea here is just to get a better understanding of what type of munitions are on the bottom, how many are there, what kind of state they're in, and then from that we can actually look at the different information and determine what needs to be done.
After World War II was over, the military had to find a solution for its dangerous old ordnance, and it found one right in front of its nose.
When these munitions corrode and the casing comes off them, in a lot of them you're left with stuff like TNT, high explosive, which is a carcinogen. So now you have that carcinogen laying on the bottom of the ocean, which will continually put stuff into the environment like that for the next 1,000 years.
The pollutants spread in the marine ecosystem and endanger marine life along with the people who rely on the ocean for food.
It's personal to me because I come from Cape Breton, and we are basically a marine community that rely on our mainstay from the ocean. We eat the fish from there, and we do have a high cancer rate here, right across the province in Nova Scotia.
Terry Long was an explosives expert in the Canadian military. He has removed and defused thousands of mines. His expertise is sought after all over the world. Long spends more than 2 decades in crisis zones. Eventually, the risk becomes too much for him. After he returns to Canada, he seeks out less dangerous work. He finds a job exploring ocean floors for oil firms, yet soon his past catches up with him. He discovers hundreds of munition sites at the bottom of the ocean.
So all these different dots you're seeing along here are actual munition sites, which are full of munitions, or shipwrecks that contain munitions. There's approximately 3,000 documented sites. Now, these are the ones that we actually looked at and documented, but we believe we only found half of them. We still believe there's another 3,000 out there.
Terry Long estimates that as many as 1 million tons of munitions were dumped off the coast of Nova Scotia. Finding them isn't easy. Only a portion of the dumping sites were documented, and it is not always certain what the munitions contain. It is a problem that is well known in Europe. On September the 1st, 1939, the Second World War began here at the Bay of Gdansk. Today, Polish scientists are searching for chemical weapons. There is no recorded information about their exact whereabouts. Accordingly, scientists must use sonar to scour the ocean floor meter by meter. For several years now, similar time-consuming searches have been taking place throughout the Baltic Sea. A complete sweep of the Bay of Gdansk alone will take decades. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Every time something suspicious appears, the ship stops and scientists investigate the spot with a camera submarine.
You can see there is no bacteria around. It's black. It should be white. So it could be that you've got contamination of this area and bacteria is not growing.
scientists are not certain about the effects of the chemical agents on the sensitive marine ecosystem, samples taken of the sediment will later show that toxic compounds have already leached into the ocean floor.
One of the alarming news we received estimating the rate of corrosion. There should be a corrosion maximum releasing the toxins to environment about 60 years past the World War II era for bombs and something like 110 for artillery shells. So as for the bombs, it's about now.
The study of the impending catastrophe has just begun, but early findings have brought disturbing news. Animals that live in areas close to dumping sites have alarmingly high rates of fatal disease.
The ocean is a continuum. If you put something there, even at great depths, it will eventually find a way to hit you in the back.
There's enough cyanide, adamsite, mustard gas and taboon in the oceans off the coast of Europe to obliterate all life on Earth. Between Ireland and Scotland, 250,000 tons of chemical weapons are rotting away in a gigantic dump. 150,000 tons of weapons were dumped in the Barents Sea and the Kara Sea. It's a ticking global time bomb. Scientists believe that toxic chemicals off Canada's eastern seaboard have already made their way into the food chain. The effects on the people who eat the local seafood have yet to be studied. Terry Long's investigations turn up something else. He travelled to Washington to find out exactly where munitions were dumped. In the archive of the Pentagon, he stumbled upon documents that he believes he was not meant to see.
The documents were open to me. I was allowed to go through the archives. There was one in particular that showed 30 tons of special weapons, which is the U.S. designator for nuclear weapons, leaving the port of Virginia and being dumped somewhere on the way to Nova Scotia.
And what happens now with it?
Nothing.
Terry Long copied the logbook of the ship that did the dumping. Authorities at the Pentagon are shocked when they find out which documents he has uncovered.
1246 mustered all dumping team. 1253 commenced dumping of special weapons. 1315 completed dumping, offloaded 30 tons of special weapons.
I just simply copied the documents and took them.
And then what happened?
When I got it, I can't say this on film. Yeah, I can't say that. No, I can't say that anything more than what I just said.
Nothing changes the 20th century more than the invention of the nuclear bomb. Humanity now has a weapon with which it can destroy the world. Whoever possesses it is invincible.
In my view, the standardization of action on ethical, security or legal grounds is much more difficult in the military than in civilian life. In civilian life, we administer prosperity. In the military, there's a different logic. They are permitted to do an action because they can do it, or because they must be able to do it because the other side can do it too. The moment we're unwilling to do the possible, we have already lost.
Since the beginning of the nuclear age, around 2,000 bombs have been detonated for testing purposes. From the Arctic to the South Seas, thousands of square kilometers have been turned into uninhabitable wastelands. Radiation from the blasts is directly responsible for some 400,000 cancer fatalities. Gary Maclis is the founder of a new scientific field, warfare ecology. The biologist has systematically investigated the effects of military actions on the environment.
The 20th century is a time where warfare, preparations, violent conflict, and what happens after war, all defined as warfare, has had a significant impact on the environment. It's an environmental problem that we have to deal with in the 21st century that emanates from the industrialized war of the 20th century.
The nuclear arms race shapes the dynamics of the Cold War. The destructive force of nuclear technology is not the only reason why it attracts the military's attention. The enormous amounts of energy it releases makes it a perfect fuel. The nuclear submarine fleets of the superpowers are some of the most prestigious objects of the Cold War. The USSR has the largest fleet by far. During the height of the Cold War, around 1/5 of the world's nuclear reactors are used by the submarines of the notorious Northern Fleet. The dangers they hold are top secret, until a former submarine officer goes public. Alexander Nikitin was a chief engineer on a Soviet nuclear submarine. In 1994, he helped prepare a report on an environmental catastrophe in the north. He was arrested and tried as a traitor.
The judge said, "I am the judge. That is the defense lawyer, and that is the criminal. And he is going to prison." He said this immediately after my arrest.
Until then, no one had dared to talk about the Soviet Union's shocking environmental neglect. Nikitin's report described one of the largest nuclear waste scandals in history. During the Cold War, 7 new nuclear submarines are launched on average per year. The fuel rods have to be replaced at regular intervals. This creates toxic waste. Over 10 years, a single submarine generates up to 200 cubic meters of radioactive waste. Some of that ends up in the ocean.
That was the usual procedure. When I served on submarines, Russia had yet to sign any treaties banning the dumping of radioactive waste in oceans and seas. Everyone was fine with that. No one objected when we dumped radioactive waste in the Kara Sea.
No one knows how much radioactive material was discharged in the ocean. No records were kept. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, much of the fleet was decommissioned and scrapped.
No one knew what was supposed to happen to the submarines once they were scrapped. No one had thought there'd ever come a time when the ships had to be scrapped. There were no documents, no regulations. I personally wrote the first guidelines for disposing of a nuclear reactor.
His case was of signal importance. In 2000, after multiple appeals on the part of the prosecution, he became the first and so far only person in Russia to be fully acquitted of charges brought by the FSB, Russia's state security service. Nikitin continued his investigative work from Norway, which in the north borders Kola Peninsula, the home of the Russian Northern Fleet. Only 20 kilometers away from Russia's border with Norway is the top-secret Andreeva Bay. No one knows how contaminated the site really is and how much radioactive material has leaked into the ground. Radioactive containers have stood open here for decades.
We believe that Andreeva Bay, where spent nuclear fuel is stored, is the most dangerous nuclear waste disposal site in the world. It's a time bomb just waiting to go off.
During war, strength is given the highest priority. Fear of the enemy's superiority pushes worries about the disposal of radioactive waste into the background. The ecological costs for the coastal waters off Norway and Russia are regarded as collateral damage. From the military's perspective, the environment isn't important until it assumes strategic significance. That is, the environment isn't important until it becomes an enemy resource. One battle that raged in northern France in 1916 produced more casualties than any other battle of World War I. On the first day of fighting alone, 60,000 British soldiers lost their lives. The Battle of the Somme dwarfed even that of Verdun and saw the deployment of 3 times as many cannons and howitzers. Still today, around 50 tons of unexploded ordnance and other types of military equipment are unearthed here each year. After several months and over 1 million people killed or missing, commanders declared a ceasefire. It was soon followed by a German withdrawal, which was less a retreat than a brilliant, if insidious, maneuver. Operation Alberich set a new, gruesome standard for warfare.
Whole areas became wastelands. Every village up to the Hindenburg Line was reduced to piles of rubble. Every tree cut, every street torn up, every well polluted. Burnt, still smouldering wreckage was the only remnant of the past. Barren, desolate, a single horrific field of fire as far as the eye could see.
The Germans build a buffer zone between themselves and the enemy. German generals argue that the devastation will safeguard the withdrawal of soldiers behind the so-called Hindenburg Line. The German High Command describes in detail what is to be done. At the end, the destruction is total, rendering the region unusable for the enemy. It is an ecocide on a modern scale.
The core of Operation Alberich is a scorched earth policy for a strip of land 20 kilometers wide. The entire area is razed to the ground.
The intentional destruction of nature was no invention of World War I. Reports describe the destruction of resources in enemy areas as early as antiquity. What is new is its exact planning and perfect execution, but that too can be outdone. The destructive force of warfare assumes unheard of dimensions in Vietnam. United States drops millions of tons of bombs on this small country in Southeast Asia, many times more than the total amount dropped by all sides in World War II. The escalation of destructive frenzy is without parallel, all the more so because the opponent never stands a chance.
The weak can survive only because they have somewhere to hide, be it the jungle, be it the mountains, or by merging into other populations where the opponent has difficulty identifying them. Once the enemy is hidden under the cover of impenetrable camouflage, spanning hundreds of square kilometers, the temptation to remove the camouflage becomes great.
The Vietnamese forces operate under the forest's thick canopy. It is the perfect hiding place and a strategic advantage that the Americans are unwilling to accept. To make use of its overwhelming air power, US forces build a network of bases throughout the country. Over the course of the war, Da Nang becomes one of the busiest air bases in the world. It is one of the centers of US aerial operations. The aircraft stationed there drop not only bombs, they also drop chemical agents.
At first, I thought they were fighting mosquitoes. They sprayed so often I can't even count the times. Sometimes they just dumped it on the ground.
The US military sprays 70 million liters of defoliants as part of a program codenamed Operation Ranch Hand. The most notorious herbicide is Agent Orange, whose name derives from its orange-colored label. One of its purposes is to eliminate the vegetation around the main supply route of the North Vietnamese Army, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, increasing visibility for US bomber pilots. Operation Ranch Hand continues for almost 10 years. By the time it's halted, around 15% of Vietnam's ecosystem has been destroyed. The area along the border with Laos used to be one of the most species-rich regions on Earth. America's herbicidal warfare program permanently changed all that. No one had the faintest idea of its long-term effects.
Many species once lived here: elephants, tigers, monkeys, even a rare type of water buffalo. The toxins and the bombs destroyed everything. By October 1974, everything was dead. Not a single living creature survived. Nothing survived.
Ngo Tung Duc is a researcher at the Hue University of Agriculture and Forestry. For years, he has been studying the area around the border with Laos. The destruction was so vast that he and his colleagues have barely made a dent in their work. Here in Ah So Valley, the footprints of war are everywhere and unmistakable.
According to the chairman of the commune, a US airbase was once located here. The aircraft here would spray Agent Orange on the surrounding territory and on Vietnamese military bases. The airbase covered around 5.5 hectares. When it rains a lot, or when the sun shines, a very unpleasant odor is emitted. The local authorities believe that barrels of Agent Orange are still buried somewhere.
But the US has given local authorities no information about their whereabouts. They only know that soldiers here cleaned the spray aircraft and washed out the tanks that contained Agent Orange. No one knows how much Agent Orange leached into the ground. A few years ago, the commune chairman had a barbed wire fence erected and thorn bushes planted to prevent livestock from drinking out of the bomb craters. After the war, people resettle the region. There are a strikingly high number of miscarriages. No one knows why. 30 years will pass before the residents first hear about dioxin. In the meantime, they continue to draw their drinking water directly from the rivers. Zoologists at the Vietnam National University in Hanoi have been studying the war's effects on animal life for 4 decades. During this time, they have made some startling discoveries.
Tôi đã tìm thấy một cái con trâu.
In 1980, while working in Tua Chien Hui province, I came across a water buffalo with 2 heads. The agent that caused this animal's deformity is the same that causes deformities in human beings. Many people in Vietnam who live in regions contaminated by toxic chemicals have conjoined twins or children with 2 heads. It's no different with animals. The water buffalo here is just one example. I have also seen pigs and cows with 2 heads. It really took me by surprise. It is an extremely bizarre effect of dioxin.
Around 3 million Vietnamese were directly exposed to Agent Orange. It remains unknown how many of them have suffered long-term effects from exposure to dioxin.
She fought on Hamburger Hill and was unable to keep an eye on her daughter. She took her daughter with her because she was still nursing. She couldn't leave her alone. Then a plane came and unloaded Agent Orange. The little one was completely covered with the substance. She's been paralyzed ever since.
Researchers were in the dark for decades. They didn't understand the mechanism of the toxin and were unable to detect it.
The trees in this area were all killed. And the first time I understood that herbicide killed the trees, it was a surprise for me, because it's different from the information we received from the US.
There is only one laboratory in all of Vietnam equipped to handle the compound. As little as a few trillionths of a gram of dioxin can have toxic effects. That's like 1 drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Researchers here are studying samples taken from the border area with Laos to find out how high dioxin has reached on the food chain.
We analyzed dioxin in fish, and then
We analyzed dioxin in fish and in people living nearby who eat the fish. We found very, very high dioxin concentrations in their blood. I think some of the highest concentrations in the world.
On the former grounds of Da Nang Air Base, officials are trying to remove the toxic compound from the environment. Excavators remove the top layer of sediment and place it in a gym-sized containment structure where a thermal treatment system will break down dioxin's chemical bonds. The project is being supported by the United States, a sign of an emerging sense of responsibility for its military actions. 40 years have passed since Operation Ranch Hand was halted, and scientists are still finding traces of the toxin in the ecosystem. Even now, several generations after the war, Dioxin is still being passed through blood and breast milk. The consequences have been terrible, especially for those who never experienced the war. Dioxin changes a cell's genetic makeup and interrupts chemical signals between cells. Its molecular structure is so similar to naturally occurring hormones that the body is unable to tell them apart. Whenever dioxin is mistaken for a hormone, chaos erupts in the neurotransmission system with devastating consequences for the body. The Vietnamese have yet to receive compensation from the United States. The same does not apply to Americans exposed to Agent Orange. Like the Vietnamese, US soldiers had no idea of its dangers. Each year, the US government hands out $13 billion to help veterans of the Vietnam War. Operation Ranch Hand destroyed an ecosystem with which not only the enemy but also US soldiers had contact. The destruction reached a point utterly beyond human control.
The use of toxic substances goes back all the way to Greek times. What is new is 20th century industrial chemical production, being able to be projected into warfare. So nature has always been collateral damage. The issue increasingly becomes nature is more fragile and warfare is more robust and powerful.
The use of Agent Orange has since been banned by international convention, but new technologies for warfare continue to be developed. Doug Rocky fought in Vietnam. After the war, he studied physics and found work at the University of Illinois, where he did research for the Army. His speciality was analyzing the risk of chemical and biological warfare. In 1991, the Pentagon called him out of retirement. They wanted him to go to Iraq.
Once the ground war was completed, they had no idea. And so the Pentagon sent a message to General Schwarzkopf and said, find Doug Rocky and the guys and tell them to clean up the DU mess. Well, we did.
Like the North Vietnamese, the Iraqis had nothing to challenge America's air supremacy. The US had a new miracle weapon, a type of ammunition made with depleted uranium, or DU, that was capable of piercing tanks. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the nuclear industry. Its half-life is 4.5 billion years. Two properties make it particularly prized by the military. Because of its very high density, it can penetrate deeply into a target. It is also pyrophoric, which means that the billions of dust particles released on impact burn as soon as they enter the air, unleashing a destructive rain of fire. Saddam's tanks stood no chance. The mission of Doug Rocky and his unit was to recover tanks contaminated with depleted uranium. They had no idea what they were getting into.
We collected it all together, we buried a lot in the desert, and we shipped a lot back to the United States that then took over 3 years to clean up.
After only a few months of work, some members of the team become sick. They suffer from symptoms that will soon be known as Gulf War syndrome. Depleted uranium ammunition is dangerous only after its dust is released into the environment. These particles are toxic and radioactive. The alpha radiation reaches only a few centimeters, but this is more than enough to harm an organism once absorbed into its body. In Iraq alone, around 3,000 tons of depleted uranium dust are released into the environment. The Pentagon refuses to ban the use of depleted uranium, however. Instead, they commission investigations to study how to minimize the dangers it poses to US soldiers. After Major Rocky returns from Iraq, the Pentagon makes him director of the Army's depleted uranium project and gives him the task of carrying out these investigations. In the desert of Nevada, Rocky and his team shoot depleted uranium ammunition at tanks under real-life conditions. Not even protective masks can prevent its tiny particles of uranium from entering the body. Doug Rocky gets sick. He too suffers from Gulf War syndrome.
You can see all the black DU contamination. Incredible, incredible amounts. So it doesn't settle down, it goes for incredible distances. And the wind is just taking it and blowing it away.
The radioactive metal spreads over vast areas. To decontaminate the land, workers would have to remove 30 centimeters of topsoil in no less than a 100-meter radius from every round fired and store it in a special facility.
So the volumes are absolutely incredible. It's totally impossible to clean it up. And I found out I couldn't do it. We found out we couldn't do it. That scared us.
Despite these warnings, the US military and NATO forces continue to incorporate depleted uranium in their arsenals. Health reports from sites where it was used are alarming. In some regions of Iraq, the child mortality rate increased sixfold. Even in remote mountain regions in Afghanistan, traces of the toxic metal can be found in the blood of village residents. Reconstruction in Vietnam has only just begun. Scientists have recently launched an ambitious project, reforesting a large tract of land once covered by thick tropical forest. By planting quick-growing acacia trees, scientists project that a closed canopy will form in a matter of years, allowing new tropical undergrowth to emerge. Scientists hope that the toxic compounds sprayed by the Americans have sunk deep enough into the soil so as not to affect the shallow roots of the acacia.
I doubt US forces considered that the Agent Orange they used against Vietnamese soldiers might affect them too. It's normal to deploy guns and bombs in war. But when toxic chemicals like Agent Orange are used, they affect not only soldiers, but also later generations. And what have they done wrong?
Recent developments in the regions of Vietnam most affected by Agent Orange give some reason for optimism. Even so, it will take decades before a complex ecosystem can re-establish itself here. For years to come, people everywhere on the planet will be contending with the ecological consequences of past military conflicts. But not only this past burdens the world's environment.
The environmental impacts of war far exceed that during violent conflict. That's why our conception of warfare ecology begins with war preparations. Just war preparations alone consume about 15 million square kilometers, 6% of the raw material used around the world. That makes the militaristic use of the Earth's resources as a critical component to overall human use of nature.
American military forces alone use as much oil per year as all of Sweden, making them by far the world's single largest consumer. During the Iraq War in 2003, the US and its allies used 30% more oil every month than was used during the whole of World War I. The modern machinery of war has an insatiable thirst for oil. A jet aeroplane uses as much fuel per hour as 500 compact cars. In the same time, an aircraft carrier consumes around as much energy as a small town does in an entire day. The military is responsible for around 10% of global CO2 emissions. A national security mentality and the primacy placed on military strength have freed the armed forces from the kind of environmental awareness long since found in the civilian sector. In this military training area in Western Germany, soldiers have been preparing for war for decades. Recently, however, German forces permitted 100 hectares to be converted into a nature sanctuary. Is this a sign of the military's budding environmental awareness? Perhaps, but one exception will always remain: war.
In a battle, the one who survives is the one who shoots faster and more effectively. How the forest looks in 10 or 20 years, what the effects will be on agriculture, whether people will wind up with deformities, are secondary questions for a military at war.
The environmental costs of war are immense, but as long as armed conflict remains a viable option, nature will be the one left footing the bill.